It's the summer of 1944. The sun beats down on the barren fields of Normandy. The rhythmic crunch of boots in the dirt is broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire. For the German infantry, advancing through the French countryside, the war has been long, hard, and brutal. Their Kar 98K bolt-action rifles have served them well, but there's a growing sense of unease in the air. They're about to face something they haven't encountered before. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of semi-automatic fire echoes across the battlefield. The M1 Garand, an unfamiliar yet powerful weapon, repeats its thunderous rhythm, firing shot after shot with lethal precision. German soldiers exchange uncertain glances. How could an American rifle, still relatively new to the battlefield, be capable of such devastating power? One soldier ducks behind a ruined stone wall, trying to process what he's just witnessed. U.S. soldiers are engaging them from a distance, firing rapidly, accurately, and continuously. No pauses to reload. Just the deadly rhythm of a weapon that's now shifting the dynamics of the war. The Germans had laughed at the Americans' reliance on their bolt-action rifles, but now the Garand has proven its worth. The power of this weapon is no longer just a rumor. It's a battlefield reality that will forever change the course of the fight. By the time 1941 rolled around, the Second World War had already engulfed much of Europe and the Pacific. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had conquered large swaths of territory across Europe. While Japan was expanding its empire throughout Asia. On the other side of the world, the United States was still reeling from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. As the U.S. entered the war, it quickly realized the need for a more effective infantry weapon to match the formidable German forces. Up until that point, the standard infantry weapon in the U.S. Army had been the Springfield M1903, a bolt-action rifle alongside the M1 carbine for more lightweight operations. However, these weapons had inherent limitations. The German Kar 98K bolt-action rifle, with its precision and range, was the standard issue for German soldiers. It was a reliable and effective weapon, but had one major flaw: its slow rate of fire. Each shot required the operator to manually cycle the bolt, making it significantly slower than modern semi-automatic rifles. The German military, however, believed this was sufficient for their needs, relying heavily on the strength of their infantry tactics and the overwhelming power of their panzer tanks. On the Allied side, the U.S. Army needed a weapon that could match the speed and efficiency of Germany's forces. While the M1 1903 Springfield was accurate, its bolt-action design limited the number of shots a soldier could take in quick succession. For close-quarters combat, the M1 carbine had some advantages due to its lighter weight and quicker action, but it lacked the range and power necessary for engagements in open terrain. This left a significant gap in U.S. infantry capabilities, especially against Germany's infantry and heavily fortified positions. In response to these issues, the U.S. Army began looking for a more modern, rapid-fire solution to counter the German advantage. What they needed was a semi-automatic rifle, one that could fire without the operator needing to manually cycle the action, giving soldiers the ability to engage targets at a faster rate, especially in the fast-moving, fluid combat of the modern battlefield. Enter John C. Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working for the U.S. Army's Springfield Armory. Garand's solution was revolutionary: a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle that would allow U.S. soldiers to fire rapidly and accurately without the need to reload after each shot. Garand's rifle, later adopted as the M1 Garand, had an 8-round clip and was capable of firing with a faster cycle rate than the German Kar 98K. For the first time, American infantrymen could engage targets with consistent firepower, making them much more dangerous to the enemy. Despite early skepticism from military officials, many were hesitant to adopt a completely new design, the M1. Garand was officially adopted in 1936. Initial trials were promising, and in the following years, it was mass-produced and distributed to infantry units. However, it would take the pressure of actual combat in North Africa, Italy, and later, Normandy, for the full potential of the M1 Garand to be realized. German soldiers, who had initially underestimated the power of the M1 Garand, would soon face it in battle, and the results would be nothing short of eye-opening. As the U.S. entered the European theater in 1942, the M1 Garand was still a relatively new weapon in the hands of American soldiers. During the North African campaign, the U.S. Army began to field the rifle in larger numbers. But it wasn't until Operation Torch in November 1942 that it would be used in significant numbers against the German forces. The Germans, who had been relying on their Kar-98K bolt-action rifles, underestimated the impact of the M1 Garand. Their infantry tactics were designed around the assumption that the average soldier would fire in controlled, deliberate volleys. With semi-automatic fire, U.S. soldiers could deliver much faster, more accurate bursts of fire, which quickly overwhelmed German soldiers. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. German soldiers had no time to react to the onslaught of rapid, accurate fire coming from the Americans, and many began to fear the sound of the Garand's distinct ping when the clip was ejected. A sound that often signaled a deadly return volley was imminent. At first, German commanders dismissed the Garand as just another piece of American equipment. They laughed at the idea that a semi-automatic rifle could change the dynamics of infantry combat. They believed their own forces had an advantage in terms of fire discipline and coordination. But once they faced the M1 Garand in the harsh realities of combat, especially during the Battle of Anzio and Operation Overlord, D-Day, the Germans' confidence began to erode. The fast, constant fire from American infantry was something they had never encountered before. Meanwhile, U.S. soldiers, initially skeptical of the Garand's new design, quickly realized the tactical advantages it provided. The rifle became the backbone of the U.S. infantry. With its ability to deliver consistent, rapid fire while remaining highly accurate at medium to long distances, it drastically increased the American soldiers' effectiveness, especially in ambushes or when moving through open terrain. The rifle's gas-operated system helped reduce recoil, making it easier for soldiers to maintain control during sustained fire. The Garand's reputation spread quickly on both sides of the battle lines. German soldiers who had once laughed at the notion of the semi-automatic rifle were now fighting for their lives against its relentless firepower. The presence of the Garand on the battlefield marked a shift in the balance of power between the infantry forces of the two sides. The Germans, who had prided themselves on their infantry discipline and marksmanship, now faced an American force that could engage more quickly and more effectively. But the Garand's impact wasn't just felt on the battlefield. It began to influence tactics and morale. For the U.S. forces, it instilled a sense of superiority in their infantry. They had the ability to dominate engagements with faster fire and greater accuracy than their adversaries. For the German soldiers, it was a rude awakening. The psychological effect of facing such a rapid, efficient weapon was profound. It forced them to rethink their approach to combat, and they began to adopt new tactics to counter the Garand, including increasing their use of snipers and heavy machine guns. The M1 Garand was a remarkable achievement in firearms technology, representing a shift toward more modern infantry weaponry that would shape the future of small arms design. The rifle's design was innovative for its time, especially its gas-operated mechanism that allowed for semi-automatic fire. This system used gas from the fired round to cycle the action, eject the spent cartridge, and load the next round, making it more efficient than previous bolt-action rifles, which required manual cycling between shots. One of the M1 Garand's most distinguishing features was its 8-round clip. Unlike the bolt-action rifles, which needed to be manually reloaded after each shot, the Garand's clip allowed soldiers to fire continuously until the clip was spent, without pausing to reload. The ping sound that accompanied the emptying of the clip became iconic, often signaling to German soldiers that the American rifleman was temporarily vulnerable, but also showing just how quickly a U.S. soldier could re-engage the enemy. The rifle was also chambered in .30-06 Springfield, a round that had been used in earlier U.S. military rifles. This powerful cartridge gave the M1 Garand an effective range of up to 500 meters, making it lethal in a wide variety of combat situations. The rifle's accuracy combined with its semi-automatic action meant that U.S. soldiers could engage enemy targets at a distance, while also being capable of suppressing fire during close-quarters combat. The weight and design of the M1 Garand also contributed to its effectiveness. At 9.5 pounds, it was heavier than many rifles of the time, but it was built to withstand the harsh conditions of battle. The rifle was durable, reliable, and, perhaps most importantly, it worked well under the extreme conditions soldiers encountered. From the cold, wet trenches of Europe to the humid jungles of the Pacific. It had proven itself in the brutal realities of war, where its performance was often the difference between life and death. The introduction of the M1 Garand rifle had significant implications for military leadership in the U.S. Army during World War II. While the soldiers on the front lines would experience its power firsthand, the impact of the Garand also reverberated through the strategic decision-making of Allied commanders. The shift to semi-automatic fire meant that commanders could depend on their infantrymen to engage enemy forces more effectively, changing how leaders viewed the roles of individual soldiers within their squads. General George S. Patton, one of the most famous and aggressive leaders in the U.S. Army, was a strong advocate for the M1 Garand. He understood the rifle's potential to change the dynamics of warfare. Patton's focus on offensive operations and rapid movement required soldiers who could sustain fire without needing to constantly reload. The Garand's ability to deliver accurate and powerful fire while allowing U.S. soldiers to remain mobile was a perfect fit for the fast-paced, aggressive tactics that Patton championed in his campaigns. At the same time, the rifle also shifted the tactical planning of American forces. As infantry units became more accustomed to the Garand, U.S. leaders adapted their strategy to capitalize on the weapon's strengths. Small unit tactics, such as fire and maneuver, were enhanced by the rifle's ability to provide rapid, accurate fire support. The rifle's performance allowed squads to maintain constant pressure on the enemy, preventing them from regaining control of key positions. The leadership of the German military, on the other hand, was slow to recognize the significance of the Garand and how it was changing the balance of infantry combat. German commanders initially dismissed the rifle, assuming that the traditional bolt-action rifle and machine guns were sufficient to hold off American advances. However, as they began to encounter U.S. soldiers armed with the Garand, it became clear that the German strategy had to change. The rapid, sustained fire from American infantry made it difficult for German forces to counterattack with their standard tactics, forcing them to adapt or risk being overwhelmed. The psychological and moral impact of the M1 Garand on both American and German forces was profound. For U.S. soldiers, the Garand became a symbol of American technological superiority and military might. As soldiers marched into combat with their new semi-automatic rifles, they were emboldened by the sense that they were no longer outgunned by the enemy. The ability to engage targets more quickly and effectively allowed American infantrymen to carry out their missions with greater confidence and precision. For German soldiers, however, the sight of American troops wielding the M1 Garand was a stark reminder of their own limitations. Initially, German soldiers were accustomed to facing bolt-action rifles and the occasional semi-automatic weapon, but the Garand's firepower and range gave U.S. infantrymen a significant edge. The psychological toll of facing an opponent capable of maintaining continuous fire, often from hidden positions or while on the move, took a heavy toll on the morale of German forces. The Garand made it difficult for the Germans to rely on their old strategies, and this shift in the balance of firepower contributed to their sense of vulnerability. One of the key moral effects of the Garand was the confidence it instilled in U.S. soldiers, especially when they were up against entrenched positions. With the Garand, American infantry could engage multiple German soldiers in a matter of seconds, forcing German forces to rethink their strategy of stationary defense. The rifle's ability to quickly suppress fire was a game-changer, and it forced German soldiers to remain on the defensive rather than attempting counterattacks. This shift in battle dynamics likely contributed to the faster Allied advances in key battles like Normandy and Iwo Jima. On the German side, however, the realization that they were outgunned left many soldiers demoralized. The once confident German infantry, which had been dominant in the early years of the war, now had to contend with a new reality. The U.S. infantry was no longer easily outmatched. As German soldiers faced the rapid, continuous fire from M1 Garands, their confidence eroded, and their tactics had to evolve. This led to a deeper sense of desperation and frustration among the German forces, which only worsened as the war dragged on. The first real test of the M1 Garand's effectiveness in battle came during the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943. As U.S. infantry advanced through the rugged terrain, German soldiers armed with the Kar-98K began to realize something had changed. The Americans, armed with their semi-automatic rifles, were engaging them at a faster pace than anything they had encountered before. It wasn't just the Garand's rate of fire that made it so effective, but the tactical change it brought with it. U.S. soldiers could now suppress enemy positions while maneuvering, keeping German forces pinned down while advancing. It was a level of battlefield mobility and firepower that the Germans had not anticipated, and it gave the U.S. infantry a significant advantage. But it wasn't just the speed of fire that made the Garand deadly. It was the psychological impact it had on the battlefield. German soldiers, once accustomed to the slow, deliberate pace of their own bolt-action rifles, were now facing a force that could fire continuously without the need to reload. The sound of the Garand's ping, marking the end of a clip, became a dreaded sound for German forces. It wasn't just an indicator that the rifle was out of ammo, but a sign that the U.S. soldier was prepared to quickly reload and continue the onslaught. This psychological pressure took a toll on German morale, forcing them to either adapt quickly or face certain defeat. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 would be the next significant test for the M1 Garand. As the U.S. forces stormed the beaches of Utah, Omaha, and Gold during D-Day, the impact of the M1 Garand on infantry combat was immediately felt. The Germans, who had once dominated the battlefield with their superior firepower and discipline, were now facing an American force that could fire more rapidly, engage multiple targets, and advance without the need to pause for reloading. The initial resistance from German forces on D-Day was fierce, but the overwhelming firepower of U.S. infantry, armed with their M1 Garands, allowed the Allies to push forward through enemy lines. For German soldiers, the Garand's firepower was a terrifying and unexpected shift in the dynamics of infantry combat. They had underestimated the effectiveness of the rifle, initially dismissing it as just another American innovation. But the reality was far different. As the fighting intensified, German soldiers began to recognize that the U.S. infantry, armed with semi-automatic rifles, had the upper hand. They could no longer rely on their own infantry tactics, which had worked well with the bolt-action Kar-98K. Instead, they had to contend with a new breed of American soldier who could fire at will, suppress enemy positions, and move forward with greater flexibility. This shift in battlefield tactics would prove decisive. The U.S. Army's new approach to combat, combined with the advantages of the M1 Garand, allowed the Allies to break through the German defenses in Normandy, despite the brutal German resistance. The Garand's semi-automatic action became a game-changer on the beaches and beyond, allowing American infantry to engage in every part of the battlefield with overwhelming firepower. It was not just the Garand's accuracy or range, but the speed of engagement that forced the Germans into a defensive retreat. As U.S. infantry began to gain ground, the Germans realized the tide of battle was turning. Their infantry, equipped with slower firing rifles, were being systematically overwhelmed by the rapid, continuous fire of the Garand. The M1 Garand, paired with effective U.S. leadership and tactics, ensured that the U.S. forces were no longer just survivors in the war. They were now a force capable of pushing back and decisively winning battles. By the end of June 1944, the Germans were fully aware of the threat posed by the M1 Garand. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a force multiplier, elevating the effectiveness of U.S. infantry tactics to a level they had not experienced before. The Garand had not only changed the way U.S. soldiers fought, but it had psychologically shaken the Germans, forcing them to rethink their approach to combat. As the battle for Normandy continued to unfold, the U.S. Army's M1 Garand began to have a profound effect on the German strategy. The Germans, who had initially underestimated the effectiveness of the M1 Garand, now had no choice but to confront the reality of facing an enemy that could fire continuously, rapidly, and with precision. The battlefields of Normandy, with their thick hedgerows and open fields, became the perfect setting to showcase the rifle's superiority. During the hedgerow fighting, a brutal, close-quarters engagement where every inch of ground was contested, the M1 Garand proved to be a game-changer. The German infantry, armed with their Kar 98K rifles, were accustomed to slower, more deliberate engagements. Their tactics were built around precise, long-range fire, where soldiers would take cover, aim carefully, and shoot with accuracy. However, the U.S. forces, armed with the Garand, were able to rapidly suppress German positions and advance under fire without waiting for a reload. The Garand allowed the U.S. infantry to control the tempo of the battle, keeping the Germans on the defensive. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was undeniable. The sound of the Garand's ping as the clip ejected became a symbol of American superiority. German soldiers, who were trained to fire cautiously and conserve ammunition, were now faced with an enemy who could fire more frequently and engage multiple targets in rapid succession. The confusion and frustration among German troops were palpable, and their once confident tactics began to crumble in the face of the American firepower and mobility. The M1 Garand's effectiveness in Normandy wasn't just about its rate of fire, it was about the tactical flexibility it gave U.S. commanders. In the chaos of battle, squad leaders and sergeants could direct their men to provide covering fire, while others maneuvered to take the enemy by surprise. The Garand's firepower allowed for greater coordination and faster decision-making, forcing the Germans to spend more time reacting to U.S. moves rather than dictating the flow of combat. The turning point in Normandy came during the Battle of St. Lo, where U.S. forces used the Garand in conjunction with tank support and airstrikes to break through the heavily fortified German positions. The Germans, who had prepared for traditional infantry combat, found themselves outmatched by the rapid, coordinated U.S. offensive. As the Americans advanced, the Garand's reliable performance in the heat of battle kept the Germans pinned down and unable to regroup. In addition to its effectiveness in infantry combat, the Garand also proved to be a significant psychological weapon. German soldiers, who had expected a slow, grinding war of attrition, were now facing a U.S. force capable of rapid, sustained fire and unrelenting pressure. The Garand's speed of engagement made it impossible for the Germans to keep up. They couldn't hold positions for long without facing a devastating wave of American fire. The M1 Garand became a symbol of American resilience, marking a distinct shift in how infantry warfare would evolve in the coming decades. This shift wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a morale breaker for the Germans. The M1 Garand made the German soldiers' previous superiority with the Kar 98K obsolete. The very speed at which U.S. soldiers could fire and reload, while still maintaining accuracy and suppressive power, left German infantry commanders scrambling for new ways to counter this overwhelming force. German soldiers, once confident in their fire discipline, began to see the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. infantry as an insurmountable obstacle. The battle at St. Lo marked a decisive moment where U.S. forces, backed by the power of the M1 Garand, tore through the German lines. The breakthrough would open the door for the Allied advance toward Paris, and the psychological toll on the Germans was immense. They now understood that their infantry was no longer a match for the well-equipped, highly mobile American forces. The Garand had not just altered the tactics, it had shifted the balance of the war in the Allies' favor. As U.S. forces moved forward, the German command began to take stock of their rapidly diminishing options. They realized that the war was being fought on new terms, with the M1 Garand playing a pivotal role in infantry warfare. The rifle, once dismissed as a curiosity, had proven itself in the crucible of combat. The Germans now faced a U.S. army that was not only well-trained and well-led, but also armed with a weapon that could outpace them in nearly every aspect of battlefield engagement. The M1 Garand had become one of the defining elements of the Allied victory. The aftermath of the Battle of Normandy marked a turning point in World War II. The Allied forces, having broken through the German defenses with the help of the M1 Garand, began their rapid advance toward Germany. The Germans, now facing a pincer movement from the west and Soviet pressure from the east, were in a state of retreat. For the first time, they were unable to stem the tide of the Allied invasion, and the balance of power on the battlefield had fundamentally shifted. The M1 Garand, alongside other technological innovations and tactical shifts, became a crucial element of the U.S. military's effectiveness. The ability to fire semi-automatically, continuously suppressing enemy positions and engaging targets at a faster pace, allowed the U.S. Army to keep the pressure on German forces. The Germans, unable to match this rate of fire, were forced to rely on increasingly desperate measures. They turned to more defensive tactics, fortifying positions and using machine gun nests and snipers in an attempt to counter the Garand's firepower. But it was too late. Their defensive efforts were only temporary, and they could not stop the American advance. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Normandy, the German military high command acknowledged that the war in the West was effectively lost. The defeat was not just a result of superior tactics, but the M1 Garand's role in the engagement. German soldiers, once proud of their infantry discipline and firepower, had faced an adversary capable of rapidly shifting tactics. This forced the Germans to adopt a more defensive, reactionary posture in the months that followed. The Germans' confidence in their infantry tactics had been shattered by the Garand, a weapon that had fundamentally changed the way infantry warfare was fought. For the U.S. Army, the impact of the M1 Garand went far beyond its battlefield effectiveness. It was a psychological victory for American forces. The Garand's reliability, combined with its ability to engage rapidly at medium to long range, gave U.S. infantrymen an edge in combat that they could exploit with new tactics. Soldiers who once fought with bolt-action rifles were now armed with a weapon that could maintain the offensive without the long pauses required for reloading. The Garand allowed them to press the attack in a way that no previous weapon had enabled. The impact of the Garand wasn't just felt in the European theater. It extended to the Pacific as well. As U.S. forces turned their attention to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Garand's semi-automatic fire continued to provide American infantry with a clear advantage over the Japanese infantry. The Japanese, like the Germans, had relied on bolt-action rifles and slow, deliberate fire. But in the face of American rapid-fire capabilities, their tactics were rendered obsolete. The Garand's impact on the Pacific theater mirrored its effects in Europe. It gave the U.S. the upper hand in infantry engagements and allowed them to advance with unprecedented speed and precision. The impact of the Garand was also felt on the German side. As U.S. infantry continued to press forward, the Germans had no choice but to adapt to the new American tactics. They began to look for ways to counter the Garand, but the reality was that no rifle in the German arsenal could match the Garand's rate of fire and reliability. The Kar-98K and MG-42 machine guns were formidable in their own right, but they could not compete with the semi-automatic fire that American infantrymen could maintain. The psychological toll on the Germans was severe. Once confident in their ability to outmaneuver and outgun the Allies, they now faced a U.S. Army that could maintain constant pressure on them. The Garand's reliability and rate of fire had contributed directly to the loss of German positions, leaving them with fewer options as the Allies continued to advance. The Germans had to contend with an adversary that was now more agile, faster, and able to sustain combat at a higher intensity. Scene point 1. The long-term consequences of the Battle of Normandy and the widespread use of the M1 Garand became a turning point in the evolution of infantry tactics in World War II, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany. The psychological and tactical impact of the Garand on the German military became undeniable. The U.S. infantry had shifted the dynamics of warfare. No longer were they relying on the slow, methodical fire of bolt-action rifles. With the Garand, American soldiers were now able to dictate the pace of the battlefield. As the Allies advanced through the Hurtgen forest, Bastogne, and ultimately into Germany, the Garand continued to play a critical role. The ability of U.S. forces to maintain fire superiority over German infantry forces allowed them to clear enemy positions with greater efficiency. This firepower advantage also forced the Germans to change their tactics. German infantry, which had been trained to rely on bolt-action rifles and small-unit tactics, now had to adapt to dealing with the sustained fire of American semi-automatic rifles. The destruction of the German war machine was, in part, a result of the inability of the German forces to adapt to the M1 Garand's capabilities. The rifle's semi-automatic nature had exposed a weakness in the German infantry. Their reliance on carefully controlled, deliberate fire was now a liability. The speed and accuracy that the Garand provided to U.S. soldiers made it far easier to break through entrenched defenses and maintain pressure on retreating German forces. No longer could the Germans rely on static defenses or carefully planned counterattacks. By the time Germany finally capitulated in May 1945, the M1 Garand had proven to be one of the defining weapons of the U.S. Army's victory. Its ability to provide rapid, consistent fire in a way that bolt-action rifles could not had been a decisive factor in the Allied success. The Garand had made the American infantry a formidable force on the battlefield, and this had a profound effect on the way the war was fought, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Germany. While the M1 Garand was certainly instrumental in the war, it wasn't just about the rifle itself. It was about how it fit into the broader evolution of warfare. The U.S. Army was changing the nature of combat, moving away from traditional fire and maneuver tactics based on slower, more deliberate rifle fire to faster-paced, aggressive warfare. The Garand was at the heart of this shift. It allowed American soldiers to maintain fire superiority and engage with the enemy in ways that no other force could match. For the German forces, the consequences were clear. Their military might, once so imposing, had been chipped away by a faster, more flexible American fighting force. The Germans found themselves trapped in a war of attrition, unable to match the speed or firepower of the U.S. Army. The loss of their infantry superiority was compounded by their lack of effective responses to the M1 Garand, and the strategic and tactical disadvantages it created. The psychological blow to the Germans was also significant. As they faced the relentless pressure of U.S. infantry, armed with weapons that could fire more rapidly and effectively, the Germans knew they were at a distinct disadvantage. The M1 Garand forced them to change their battlefield tactics, and ultimately, it contributed to the breakdown of their defensive strategy. The rifle was a symbol of the American advantage, a reminder that the U.S. military was not just overcoming German forces, but outpacing them at every turn. After the war, the M1 Garand was hailed as one of the most important infantry weapons of World War II. Its design influenced the development of future military rifles, including the M14, and its legacy continued to shape infantry tactics long after the war ended. The Garand's combination of semi-automatic fire, accuracy, and reliability had proven that the age of bolt-action rifles had passed, and the new era of semi-automatic and automatic infantry weapons had arrived. For the U.S. Army, the rifle was a key factor in the success of their infantry operations. The M1 Garand allowed American soldiers to approach combat with an unmatched level of firepower, ensuring they could continue pressing forward even in the most brutal conditions. The rifle's role in the success of the D-Day invasion, the Battle of the Bulge, and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany made it a symbol of the U.S. military's technological superiority and battlefield effectiveness. The M1 Garand rifle remains one of the most iconic and significant weapons of World War II. Its impact extended far beyond its technical specifications. The Garand's semi-automatic action changed the course of infantry warfare, providing U.S. soldiers with the firepower and accuracy necessary to take the fight to the Germans and Japanese. The rifle not only gave American troops a tactical advantage, but also inspired confidence in a way that no other weapon could. For the U.S. Army, the Garand was a symbol of innovation and military superiority. It was a tool that allowed infantrymen to stay on the offensive, suppress enemy positions, and hold the initiative. With its introduction, the American military demonstrated its ability to adapt to the evolving demands of modern warfare. It was a pivotal piece of the puzzle that allowed the U.S. to go from being on the defensive after Pearl Harbor to leading the final assault that would bring about the defeat of the Axis powers. For the German military, the Garand was a rude awakening. Their long-standing dominance in infantry tactics and their reliance on bolt-action rifles was no longer enough. They were forced to adapt to a battlefield where speed, accuracy, and the ability to maintain fire without reloading had become crucial. The psychological impact of the Garand was evident in the way German soldiers responded to its firepower. The rifle represented a new era of combat, one where precision and rapid engagement replaced the deliberate, slower-paced tactics that had once served them well. In the end, the M1 Garand was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the Allied triumph. It embodied the technological advances and tactical shifts that defined World War II. Its legacy not only shaped infantry tactics in the U.S. Army, but also influenced military thinking worldwide, establishing the standard for modern battlefield rifles. The rifle's role in the war, especially in Normandy, Italy, and the Pacific Islands, helped shift the balance of power in favor of the Allies, accelerating the inevitable defeat of the Axis. More than just a tool of war, the Garand was a psychological weapon, instilling confidence in the American soldier and fear in the hearts of their enemies. As a result, the Garand continues to be remembered not just for its design, but for its role in changing the nature of combat and ensuring victory in World War II.